prioritize, develop a plan, you implement and communicate. Easy peasy, right? Tomorrow we'll all do this at our organizations and we'll all be at the leadership level. Maybe not that easy. Benchmarking is really important, and this should be a continuous exercise, not just a snapshot in time. I think it's valuable to refresh this benchmarking every year at the very least, maybe a little sooner, maybe every 6 months for a light refresh if things are changing quite quickly. And this really allows you to hone in on what are those priorities. If you think of that word cloud in the beginning, no one can tackle every single one of those items. You can't boil the ocean, and then you'll be less effective. So identify what's most important and what are the key priorities. And some things to ask yourself as you're benchmarking is, who are your peers and competitors? Who does your organization admire? Like, what are the leaders in this space, and what are they doing? There's a lot of information online that's publicly available, so taking some time to really understand what they're doing is important. The other thing to ask is, what data can I actually collect? At the end of the day, data is a really important piece of progressing sustainable initiatives across the company. Ask yourself, let's focus on, say, waste. Do I have waste data? Where does it sit in my organization? How can I collect it? Identifying what data is out there can really kind of help inform your priorities. And if you find that the data doesn't exist, maybe how can you get that data? What's a good proxy? Who are the key stakeholders? There's a lot of ESG raters and rankers. So these are third parties that will look at surveys or public information around different facets of ESG and assign a score. An example could be the CDP. This is a public survey that companies respond to, focused on climate action, and then you get a score from an F to an A. Another example could be MSCI. This is a third-party rater or ranker that investors use. So they look at publicly available information, and then they also assign an ESG score. And the main audience there is investors. So ask yourself, or ask your organization, which one of these raters and rankers are important, and then use that in your benchmarking. And then lastly, are there emerging regulations that will impact my company? Here in Colorado, we have a extended producer responsibility bill. So if you're an organization that will be impacted by that, how does that fit into these plans? And are you receiving customer feedback? In the world of social media, there is an infinite amount of feedback, so really kind of understand what you're hearing from clients, customers, other stakeholders. And then it's important to distill all this information. So one of the things you need to be able to do to be successful in sustainability is communication. Like taking all these data points that you've collected and summarizing it in a way that's compelling to decision makers. I like to do it this way. I find that a stoplight really helps. No one wants to be seen as red. It's a good way to get some motivation. And then you'll identify what are the key themes that come up. And I think this is a nice way, but there's lots of ways. Just think about what works in your organization. Who's my audience? You might not have the same message for everyone, depending on who you're speaking to. That's where that earlier, get to know your stakeholders internally is important. Get to know what makes them tick and what they care about. In my experience, if I was talking to finance, I focus heavily on how this is a cost savings or how this could add value. The other benefits are tangential. If I'm talking to operations, I focus a lot on how this will make things more efficient. So get to know your audience and what really speaks to them. If you have the resources, I definitely advise a materiality assessment. This is an exercise that your organization can take to really understand what topics within ESG are most material from a financial impact. So what's the financial impact, like this extended producer responsibility bill? If we don't comply with it, are we going to get hit with a fee, for example? So that's like a financial impact. And then how your company or your organization has an impact on the outside world. So an example there is emissions, like how are your operations contributing to climate change. And then through this, that's called impact materiality. And through this exercise, you'll be able to filter this word cloud down to what are the highest priorities. Benchmarking is a piece of this, but it's a lot more than benchmarking. It really involves deep stakeholder engagement. And you know, when I've done it, we've involved high levels of the organization so they can co-create this materiality assessment. If you don't have the resources, that's okay. Doing that benchmarking is a really good step to filter down, and then you can think about what you need to, how you can make the case to do this formal assessment. So you've identified the priorities, you've kind of narrowed down that wide universe. The next step is prioritizing and planning. Again, easy peasy, right? So what I like to think about in this phase is all right, we've identified what's material. And I recommend when doing that, don't do that in a vacuum. Like, don't just do it on your own. Go back to your stakeholders and your organization and say, this is what we've seen. Do you agree? Is there something missing? Open it up for discussion. When you can co-create the strategy, there's a lot more ownership and consensus around it, as opposed to doing it in a vacuum. Are there quick wins? Is there something you can implement quickly? Maybe it doesn't require a large budget or a huge amount of resources. That's a nice way to get excitement around sustainability, and then can help build the case for future resources. Identify if any of those exist. And then think about, what does each step of the maturity curve look like? You might be in compliance or efficiency, but use this as an opportunity to think about, what does leadership mean? What does purpose mean? And then have those conversations again with your organization. And then back to KPIs. How do we actually measure this? Like, if we've identified diversity, what do we measure? Is it colleague diversity? Is it providing products to meet a diverse slate of consumers? If you're, a governmental organization, what's the diversity of my community, and how do I develop services that speak to each of their unique needs? And then put that governance around it, so making sure there's clear ownership. The sustainability team can't drive all of this across an organization, so really working with those partners in a good governance structure. I really like this example from University of Washington. So you can see what they have as their priorities down here. So they kind of went through this exercise, and decarbonization is one. Resource responsibility, so there is a number, and this is publicly available. The link is down there if anyone wants to look at it after. And they've made it digestible. So the targets are here. They tell you which priority each of these targets aligns to, what their performance is, and what actions they're taking. So it's a nice way to, again, kind of condense this complicated topic with so much detail behind it in a way that can motivate action and speak to those stakeholders and tell them what you're doing. So implementing, this is often the hardest part and requires, again, the most time and change management. And that's okay. I think as you build that plan in the beginning, really kind of be thoughtful about what implementation looks like, and what it'll take. Here, the questions I like to think about to kind of frame it is there budget available? If there's not, that's okay. Think about, are there incentives? A lot of utilities, for example, are offering programs and rebates if you install efficient equipment. Can you take advantage of those? Is there creative financing available? Are there these quick wins that you can start to implement? And then kind of use that to, again, build that case for long-term resources. How can I quantify the benefits? Again, back to KPIs. That's a theme that keeps coming up. And then who is key to successful implementation, getting them on board and co-creating what that looks like. And then lastly, like, what tools and resources do I need? Everyone's busy. Most of the time, the folks that are going to implement have a day job, and sustainability is one more thing on their list. So is there a toolkit? Are there checklists that I can use to make it easier for them? Do I need to bring in consultants? Do I have the budget to do that? And then I thought these were nice examples of what a tool can look like to help implementation. Here, Sustainable Office Checklist provides some key things that folks can do. And then it's nice because it's off the shelf, so people don't have to recreate the wheel. And then this is guidelines for packaging designers. So in this step 2, really thinking of who your audience is and kind of what's important to them. Lastly, communicate. So I like to say that half of sustainability is telling people what you're doing. If you don't share the story and the journey, no, it's almost as if you're not doing anything, for better or worse. We're seeing a lot of interesting thinking around how to communicate effectively in sustainability in these past few years with the pandemic, with anti-ESG, with legislation coming out. So again, here is where it's important to develop a tailored plan that speaks to your organization. And communication is internal, so keeping your stakeholders, your employees, updated on progress and what you're doing. Maybe that's through scorecards or through intranets or whatnot, and external, like what I showed you earlier from the University of Washington. And then highlight your journey. This is a journey. Progress is not perfect, but highlight that journey. Transparency is important here. And then use this as an opportunity to kind of go back through that circle. So the 4 stages I showed earlier really are a cycle. So once you've done this, kind of think back. I thought this was a nice example of what communication can look like. Up here, it's a hotel company. Up here, they were transparent in that the pandemic has, impacted some progress against their goals, and they show that here. And then they talk about what they're going to do as they get out of the pandemic. So here's an example of transparency and authenticity in communications and how you can do that. Great. Any questions before I get into case studies? Awesome. So that is all great, but I wanted to give some examples of what this looks like in action. These are things that I've seen throughout my career, that I've, seen through my education, through my peers, of kind of like how organizations can use the steps I've outlined to really go from compliance to purpose. The first case study is a privately held chemical manufacturer. So It's a family-founded organization, still family-owned, about 300 employees, so pretty small, but their customers were large Fortune 500 organizations. And these customers really started having a lot more questions around sustainability. They were asking, as these customers were, and the customers here were B2B, they were on their own journeys, and they were in that phase where they're engaging their supply chain kind of outside of their own four walls. And this company got an EcoVadis survey from one of their customers. Being a family-founded company, social responsibility was important. You know, they are really visible citizens in the community. They've had a long history in this community, but there was never necessarily a formal program, if you will. It was definitely something important. And some of their products that they made had environmentally preferred benefits. So they made additives, and they had one that reduced curing temperature, so that leads to less emissions. Another one that replaced some heavy metals with less damaging metals and had the same end use. So there is a nice story here, not just through the fact that they're a family-centered company, but the fact that their products also contribute to more preferable environmental outcomes. So they got this EcoVadis survey from a customer, and at first, there was a lot of apprehension. I don't know if anyone's ever seen one of these, but this is a long survey with like hundreds of questions, asking things like, how much time off do you give your employees? Do you have an environmental management system? And the organization was very much like, why do they care how much time off we're giving our employees? That has nothing to do with the product. What really helped is they spoke to their customer that gave this survey and really understood what their motivations were. And then they were like, oh, this isn't meant to be a punitive exercise. This is to understand what we're doing to support our own communities and how we're having a positive impact. And then a task force was developed to complete this survey. And that survey provided a roadmap of what are key priorities and outcomes. So before, where there was not really any program, now they started to formalize some KPIs that sat within environmental health and safety and operations. And this was like that first step in the journey, if you think about kind of compliance to purpose. Second case study is a large real estate operator developer. So here, there is a lot of good work happening. And then this is publicly traded company, has over 2,000 properties, US, UK, Canada. They have a $48 billion enterprise value, a member of the S&P 500. So large company, lots of property. If you think about it, lots of impacts within those properties and communities. So here, they had a lot of good work happening really at the property level. This is what I like to call random acts of sustainability. But there was very little leadership oversight, and I would say not necessarily a clear strategy. So you could think they're at efficiency here. There was good work, especially where there were savings. They were pretty early on in upgrading lighting and whatnot, but pretty random and kind of one-off. What kind of triggered the jump from efficiency to leadership is investors started asking about sustainability. And that's when it got on leadership's radar. And they were like, what are we doing here? What can we be doing? And here, that questioning from the outside really triggered the organization to bring it up from the property level to a higher level and kind of develop long-term strategy and KPIs and take it from these random acts of sustainability to a more cohesive program. So here, an outside stakeholder is really what triggered that mindset shift. And then they used a rater and ranker to kind of help think about what we need to focus on first. Being a property developer, built environment's important, so there was definitely a lot of work there. And then diversity was something that was really important in providing good economic opportunities, not just to own employees, but to the surrounding community. And of course, the resident experience, so the folks in those properties, the tenants, really making sure that they have a good experience. It's focused on health and wellness and sustainability. And then last case study is large multinational organization. So operations in over 100 countries, member of the Fortune 500, over 10 billion in revenue. Here is an example of that jump from leadership to purpose. So this organization was already doing a lot, and they had a really robust program with resourcing, a decent-sized team. There were teams within other parts of the organization, but leadership wanted to take it to the next level. They were like really looking to get to that purpose. What does that mean for my organization? Again, here, really driven from the top. They started at compliance, made it to leadership, and now the organization wanted to take it to the next level. And then what they did, because they had this high-level support, is they engaged an outside expert to develop a plan for what does purpose mean. This was a really robust exercise. I think it took like 6 months, maybe more. And that expert, did materiality. They got a lot of insights. They really kind of dug deep into what that could mean for this organization. Having leadership bought in and kind of through the journey really helped kind of also build out what resources are needed and how we can actually implement and practically move in this direction. And they use the output, this in step 2, to really announce a new set of goals, develop new governance, communicate out this new vision to their stakeholders. And that was a nice example of kind of moving from leadership to purpose. Some best practices. So I think everyone is getting a copy of these slides. I won't read them all, but I found that these best practices have really helped me throughout my career, and while the details matter at every company, the approach is largely the same. So link it to your business strategy, whatever it is that you've identified as priorities. Link it back to that central business strategy. That's something that I didn't quite get in the beginning. I am an environmental engineer and an environmental scientist, and I used to think very much like an engineer. What's the problem I need to solve, and how do we get there? And then I had a mentor who was like, this is all good, but your message is falling flat. So I think that was something that was really invaluable to me. So kind of like making clear that you understand what the drivers are, and again, speaking that language. Identifying those quick wins, again, getting people excited. This could be something as simple as having an Earth Day event. It doesn't have to be like a really big production. It doesn't have to cost a lot of money. Just gets your organization excited. Be creative here if resources are challenging, which they can be. Think about kind of like what resources are available. So at that real estate company, one quick win was local utilities were providing free upgrade programs and installation programs. So they come into your property if you were a customer of that utility, and for free, they'd upgrade your lighting. They'd install low flow aerator in your faucet. They'd wrap exposed piping, which led to cost savings. It didn't cost money. It required a little bit of time and coordination, but that was a nice quick win, which got the organization and these properties excited about what else can we do. Really monitor emerging trends. This field is changing so fast, so there's a lot of value in kind of seeing what's on the horizon, going to events like this, going to webinars, really staying up to date. I feel like half my time is spent reading articles, signing up to publications, and then bring it to the attention of your organization, to, one, identify risks, and then opportunities. Companies that kind of really saw that Gen Z millennials are really interested in sustainability are really well positioned to capture that market. So what does that mean for your company, your industry, your organization? Data, again, can't hammer that enough. It's so important. At the end of the day, we have to be able to show what our impact is, and getting better data is becoming more and more important. So in the planning phase, ask yourself, what's that data management look like? How can I get metrics? One example I can give is in one of my organizations, we had a really robust philanthropy program, gave a lot of grants, but weren't always able to say what was the outcome of all this giving, and then use that to inform future giving. So in new waves of giving, we really worked with those partners to say, these are the metrics we'd like to track. So how many lives did you improve? Let's say you're giving to a disaster relief organization. How many disasters did you kind of support? What did that look like? What did you give out? Really getting quantifiable metrics to, again, help inform your strategy. Scorecards. I found that scorecards always give me, you get a reaction. So no one wants to be red, no one really wants to be yellow. So having that scorecard can really give you a good reaction and motivate that action. Green ambassadors, tap into those people that are passionate. We know resourcing is tough, but really find out who these passionate folks are, tap into them, and use them to help move your strategy along. And then feedback. This shouldn't be done in a vacuum. This isn't a static exercise. Kind of bring your organizations along on the journey, and then get their input and incorporate it if it makes sense. Key takeaways. So I'm going to go to the last one first. Stay positive and persistent. This is a journey. It's important to stay positive. That positivity can be infectious. Use that to really kind of drive you forward, even when things seem like they're not going that great. Just stay positive. Find out what your organization's doing. They're probably already doing something. Find out what that is and how can you take it to the next level. And then data and benchmarking, again, that if you only go away with one thing, data and benchmarking are the one or two things that you should go away with. Some resources here, just some examples of resources that you can start to dig into. There's a lot of good information out there, and you don't always have to reinvent the wheel. So if there's an area that you find important, do some Google searching. There's probably resources you can access, and then tailor to your own organizations as needed. So definitely take some time to see what exists out there as well. And this is non-exhaustive, but just meant to give you a sample of what might exist. Great. Questions, comments?
Thank you so much for your presentation, super informative. My question is largely around the communication piece. We've found that, like on our website, for example, our impact section and section about our very little clicks, like we're talking like a fraction of other aspects. We're a restaurant group, Snooze Eatery. We also even put stuff on our tables. We try to steer our guests largely to that and communicate a lot of the good work that we are doing, but we find that whether it's a social media post, it's a section of our website, or something that we're trying to put directly, like a section of our menu where we're talking about some of the things that we're doing. It's just not really grabbing people's attention. And so if you have recommendations on how we might be able to increase engagement and get the word out.
Yeah, I think if you've tried kind of having dedicated information, you've tried social media section of the menu, incorporate it within your other communications. So instead of having your own section of the menu, add that information next to each menu item as one way to engage your guests. I think it's good to have the information there. There's, for those folks that are seeking it out, pointing them to where it lives is still good. So I definitely, recommend continuing that, but maybe try like weaving it into other communications that you already have. So on the menu, instead of having a separate section, add it right into that body of the menu and see if that increases uptake. And if you get feedback that way, see how that works. If you're going out with a social media post, it doesn't have to be centered on ESG. That can just be something that's added into it. So try that and see if you get increased engagement that way.
Thank you. So I have a question. I find when I'm having these conversations with stakeholders, I'm trying to figure out, should I be saying, hey, this is a really great opportunity to differentiate ourselves. If I look at our 5 other competitors, 3 out of the 5 mention it, we could be a leader here, versus showing up and saying, hey, we're close to being a laggard here. Like, you saying nothing, like, don't be last, and I know that comes down to motivation, like, what are your competitors doing? What are your stakeholders caring about? But generally in the sector, I would hope that we're getting closer to like telling people, hurry, don't miss this boat. But for where we are today, do you have thoughts on the best way to have those conversations, or if there's a sweeping strategy I can employ that's like the right messaging around that?
Yeah, I wish I had a silver bullet answer, but it is so unique to your organization. In my experience, I've definitely been at places where they frankly didn't want to be a leader, and that's okay, but I'm sure no one wants to be a laggard, and maybe they say we're fine with being a laggard. So what I advise is like digging into what does that mean, and kind of framing it in a new way. So I think here it's really, again, kind of getting to know where your organization is. If they're in the early phases, thinking leadership might not be the best approach. Maybe that's just not their ambition. But at the very least, if you have data, it could be that your ratings and rankings are going down. That tends to be motivating. It could be that there's a cost savings. It could be you're getting some negative feedback from an employee or a customer. So thinking about and maybe don't say laggard, kind of like framing it in a different way and trying that. You might have to try it a few different times and kind of go to different stakeholders. Here's also where those allies are so important. Sometimes, depending on where the message is heard from can really impact it. That used to frustrate me a lot, but I've kind of embraced it in my career. So if you have an ally or someone in your organization you can ask, I think that's something I would advise too.
So we're actually having the opposite communication problem. So we're a publicly traded customer or company, and our customers and potential customers are asking a lot about our ESG program. And so I'm spending time filling out individual custom questionnaires. I see EcoVadis, we're now part of that ecosystem. We have an ESG site, like how can we best streamline that so we can actually put more of our efforts towards our ESG program instead of just asking these, answering these individual questionnaires, yet that ties to revenue. And so there's, incentive to do that.
You must be living my life right now. I'm pretty new to my organization. I joined almost a year ago, and we get customer surveys all the time, and they just get sent to me. So here it's toolkits. I think toolkits and resources can be useful. I just got done developing an FAQ document, and then if I get a customer survey, usually it comes from a client team, I direct them to the FAQ. And here, you have to know your organization, but I have the ability to say, look at this FAQ and come back to me if there's something that's not answered. I think having those tools and resources are useful. And then we're also kind of revisiting the role of our ESG report, especially now as it's moving from voluntary to regulatory. So it can be more of a data update with kind of some case studies that get updated, but less of a 200-page glossy publication. So I think that is another nice way to start to make that process less time-consuming. If there's these regulations that will impact you, use that as an opportunity for how do we revisit this communication. And what's helping me is now that it's more regulated, other teams want to be involved. So I get to kind of give them more ownership so I can focus on these, like you said, implementation. I think we have time for one more. Two more, yeah.
Hi, my name is Greta Shetler. I was just actually up at New York Climate Week, and something that you mentioned was actually repeated across many of the companies there. They said that the efficiency has moved things along slowly, but the investors is actually what's made everything move rapidly within the past year. And for a lot of people working in the sustainability or solution side, they're really excited about that. So I'm wondering from your perspective, again, kind of maybe piggybacking off some of the other questions, if you're trying to move things within a company, do you ever look at or advise or see any strategies of how to maybe engage investors or directly that you've seen has worked well to get them to start asking kind of in a, I don't know, in a covert way, but a way to like help drive change through the organization?
That is a really interesting question because yeah, so I've started to join a lot more investor calls. And I think here what I've found is they're not going to ask on an earnings call. So if that's what we're hoping, that on an earnings call, unless you're in a really specific industry, they're not going to ask. Where they are going to ask is through like continuous engagement. So we have an engagement cycle with our investors. I'm part of that, which was unthinkable maybe 5 years ago. And then they'll ask pointed questions about our ESG report. So now what I'm doing is summarizing this feedback that we've heard through these calls and presenting that to senior leadership and the board. So what I might recommend is like reach out to your investor relations team and ask what their engagement looks like with these investors, and then see if you can participate in some of these calls. Like in one of these calls, they introduced me, and that kind of triggered the engagement team to ask some environmental questions. So perhaps try that and see how that works.
All right, one more question, and I'll come your way.
And my contact info is on the slides, so I believe everyone will get these slides. So if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.
So you talked a lot about, for lack of a better word, how to get other people excited. I'm curious if you could speak quickly to what motivates you and what's keeping you in this space and what's keeping you hopeful and keeping you driven.
I love that question. Thank you. I've always been an environmentalist. I watched a lot of Nat Geo, frankly, when I was a kid. And always, I grew up in New York, so I didn't grow up out here where I have the mountains in my backyard. I really didn't have a lot of exposure to the outside except through TV. But I always had this connection to the environment, and my parents kind of fostered my hunger for knowledge. So when I got to college, that was something that I really leaned into. And that kind of like young idealism, really just loving animals and the planet, is what motivated me to pursue this career. And what keeps motivating me is, while the journey is slower than I would hope, we're still making great progress. The Inflation Reduction Act was announced almost a year ago. That's a monumental piece of legislation. It went from where climate change isn't something you ever heard about to companies talking about it all the time. And future generations, I love seeing young activists, that new generation that's kind of like pushing this to the next level. So that also keeps me motivated and hopeful. But I won't lie, it's hard sometimes. So I think what I advise young people is kind of like, go back to what got you excited to get into this in the first place. Kind of go back to that when you're getting frustrated in the day-to-day. That's worked for me. And, take a step back. Like, if you need to take a vacation, kind of sign off, do that. Give yourself that mental space. Focus on wellness.
Wonderful. Can we all please give Shay a big round of applause? I will just say that I think that piece of just like personal resiliency, so thank you for that question, that personal resiliency is super critical for all of us in this space, really trying to figure out how we really harness that balance so that we can continue this work. And I also encourage you to share those ideas at lunch. I am the one holding you for lunch, so I recognize that. Lunch is upstairs on the 3rd floor where we started this morning. It is a lovely buffet. I'm really excited about the menu with Serendipity. And we will be having lunch, and then sessions will be starting promptly at 1 p.m. Please go ahead and check out the app so you could pre-plan where you're headed for your next session. If you'd like a